Hey there, Herle Burlyites. I want you to think back to that moment in your life when you got your first mobile phone. Maybe you were 14 years old and you had to wear down your parents over 6 or 7 screaming matches. Maybe you got a job in politics and it was a perk to divert your attention from an obscenely small salary. Or maybe you just strolled right into a telestore because you dig cute hippos and baby lemurs. Whatever it was, I bet access to a cell phone wasn't too difficult. That's not the case for so many vulnerable young people across this country. And it's why our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is now offering their Mobility for Good program nationwide. Mobility for Good is a collaboration between TELUS, the Children's Aid Foundation of Canada, and select Centre de Jeunesse Fondation in Quebec that gives youth aging out of foster care the tools they need to live independent lives. So, what does that mean? Young people get a free smartphone and a TELUS plan with unlimited nationwide talk and text and 3 gigabytes of data a month. TELUS provides the service for free, but the bills appear in the youth's name to help them build positive credit, which gives them a leg up as they lean into their journeys of financial independence. More than 5,400 young people are already enrolled in the Mobility for Good program, and TELUS is committed to ensuring that even more Canadians, regardless of their location or circumstances, are all connected to the technology and resources they need to participate in our digital world. To learn more about how TELUS helps us stay all connected for good, visit telus.com/mobilityforgood. All right, Herle Burlyites, let's get to the pod. It's a 2-parter today, and auspiciously, it is the 100th episode of the Herle Burly. From the bottom of my heart, a place where only pools of dark rum and an everlasting love for Ronnie Lancaster reside, I'd like to thank all of our loyal listeners for putting up with us for this long. So I think it's fitting that we welcome a really phenomenal guest for part 1. We're thrilled to have author, ethnographer, explorer, and filmmaker Wade Davis join us today. Wade's bio is rather long and impressive, so I'm going to try to hit the highlights. He holds degrees in anthropology, biology, and received his Ph.D. in ethnobotany, all from Harvard University. He is the leadership chair in cultures and ecosystems at risk at UBC. Wade is explorer in residence for National Geographic. He's written numerous books. I tried to add them up, but I lost count at about 20. We're going to talk about his latest, Magdalena, River of Dreams, a story of Colombia, and what it says about indigenous wisdom and environmental degradation. Wade's also published over 1,800 articles, his most recent for Rolling Stone, The Unraveling of America, How COVID-19 Signals the End of the American Era. Published on August the 6th, has been a legitimate sensation, racking up more than 10 million social media comments within a week. So we'll chat about the politics and future of the United States and the illusion of American exceptionalism. For part 2 of the pod, we'll bring on our political panel, the strategically brilliant and legitimately hilarious, the generously cursing Jenni Byrne and Scott Reid. We'll pick up on the conversation with Wade, plus all that's notable in Canadian politics this week. Wade Davis, I am super thrilled to have you on the Herle Burly. Thanks for joining the Zoom box with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Dave.
How are you? You
fine.
are a traveler. You like to travel. You must have been boxed in by this COVID thing in a really uncomfortable way.
Not really, in an odd sense. I mean, despite obviously one's concern for all the suffering and the both economic and personal that people are going through, I was living such a frenetic life that I look back on the travel schedule that I had almost like a violent hallucination. I think this is something a lot of us have felt. I mean, I actually saw my garden grow. I planted a fruit orchard, and like everybody else, I'm discovering. It sounds silly to say, but the world of online communication. You don't have to travel to Cleveland to speak to the Ball Bearing Manufacturers Association. You can do it from home, which makes it a lot more pleasant. So in that sense, it's kind of interesting, but it's changed.
Although don't underestimate the fun of a ball bearing convention. Exactly. Those guys know how to party.
No, but it's interesting. Like this piece on Rolling Stone. It began just as kind of a whim. People had asked me to write about COVID, and I had decided I didn't really think I had anything new to say, and there was so much noise out there. And I was paddling around our little island here off the coast of Vancouver, and it suddenly dawned on me COVID really wasn't a story of medicine or morbidity or mortality. It was really a story of culture, you know. And I came back and I wrote the piece in an evening, and I sent it to an old friend of mine, Jan Wenner, and Jan sent it to his son. Before he knew it, it appeared in Rolling Stone, and it just hit some kind of nerve. It's had over 332 million social media impressions, and it's trended on their site for 5 weeks, which is unheard of for a piece of journalism. And I think it put a perspective on COVID that I think people hadn't really thought about that much, or at least it brought things together in a way that provoked a lot of interest.
You know, I'm an unusual guy because I am a music nut, and in there, something you said just twigged to me. And if we ever have a beer together or have the occasion to meet, you're going to have to explain to me how Jan Wenner, the founder of Rolling Stone magazine, became a friend of yours, because that's pretty cool in and of itself. And seems unfair given the other cool things that happen in your life. Let's talk about Magdalena first, if only because I made the effort to read the book. And so I need to thank you for that, because I'm pretty darn sure that if you weren't coming on to talk to me, that I would not have read a book about Colombia. Because I'm not very well read, and there's probably places I ought to start before Colombia. But nonetheless, first of all, I was attracted to open the book because Magdalena was my mother's name. And what a beautiful name that is. What a beautiful word that is.
That's so interesting, because, you know, one of the ironies of the story of the Magdalena is the Mississippi of Colombia. You know, I mean, it runs south to north. It's an echo of the Mississippi that comes north to south. It's like the Mississippi, a corridor of commerce, but also the fountain of culture, the wellspring of music and poetry and prayer. And Colombian music plays a big role in the book. You know, of the 100 most popular YouTubes on the internet, 85 are music videos, and of those 10 are Colombian. So, you know, cumbia, salsa, poro and tambora and all these rhythms, you know, that, and all the musicians say that, you know, the source of the rhythm is the river, and without the river, there's no music. And by the same token, people say without the river, there's no soul of the nation. And to cleanse the soul of the nation, we must cleanse the river. And, you know, this love affair that I've had with Colombia began innocently enough when my mom back in 1968 told me rather unexpectedly that Spanish was a language of the future, and she saved up money working as a secretary in a small elementary school to send me with a group of schoolboys to Colombia in 1968. And that was a long way away in 1968, at a time when most Canadians had never been in an airplane. And I was the youngest of the lads, and the most fortunate, because the others tended to be billeted with wealthy families and spent a sort of sweltering season in the streets of Cali. And I was isolated alone in a small and more modest family up in the mountains. And whereas many of the Canadian lads became terribly homesick, I felt like I had finally found home. I mean, I was 14. I kissed a girl for the first time. I got drunk for the first time. And I was living in a culture that was sort of full of colores y cariño, colors and love. And you know, as you know, Dave, in Canada, we don't really dance with our girlfriends' mothers at the age of 14, but in Colombia, you do. And it was simply charismatic, and this kind of understanding of the frailty of the human spirit. I mean, I really felt not only not homesick, but like I finally found home. And then I returned when I was 19 and 20. And by that point, I was an acolyte of the great botanical explorer, Richard Evans Schultes, who was the man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. And I traveled throughout Colombia, really sleeping where my hat fell. And I kind of believed that bliss was an objective state. And if you opened yourself to the world, you know how it was back then. And I drank from every stream, both literally and metaphorically. And naturally, I was constantly sick, but even malaria seemed part of the story, these fevers that would break with the dawn, you know. And at one point, I, on a day's notice, agreed to guide someone 300 miles through swamp and rainforest. We got lost for 10 days. And when I finally emerged, I had lost, 30 pounds, and I was sort of covered with fungus and had just the ragged clothes on my back. And I was drenched in vomit from the passengers of this small plane I had flown to Panama City on. And I got off the plane with $3 to my name, nowhere to go, but I'd never felt more alive, And I wrote a book about those years. It became a book in English, One River. And the Spanish translation came out as El Rio in 2002. And you would have thought...
It took off.
Yeah, I mean, Colombia was kind of a failed state, and you wouldn't think that a book on botanical exploration would hit a nerve, but it did, because it became kind of a map of dreams for two generations of young Colombians who couldn't travel in their own country. And Colombia has been so misunderstood. Yes, there's been 50 years of war, 220,000 dead, 7 million internally displaced. But the war wouldn't have lasted a day if it wasn't for the profits from the cocaine trade. I mean, think about this, Dave. At the height of the Medellin cartel, the cartel was making $70 million a day. They were budgeting $1,000 a week just to buy elastic bands, just to wrap the money in.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen a feral hippopotamus?
Yeah, that's Pablo Escobar's finca in the Medio Magdalena. He was just he lived in the realm of the phantasmagoric. Actually, a friend of mine's son.
It's not that much funny about Pablo Escobar, but this is kind of funny about Pablo.
Well, Pablo Escobar made life cheap, but a friend of mine made a film about it. These incredible hippos who've gone feral, and they threaten fishermen up and down the Medio Magdalena. It's sort of his lingering legacy and everything. But I think the main.
So he started a game park on his estate, and all the animals that he brought from Africa and other places all ultimately died after his empire crashed. But the hippos went feral.
Yeah, they did. And, it's a perfect habitat for them, the lowland forests and marshes of the lower Magdalena. And they're still there. But the thing that I think is important to realize is, can you imagine if Canada had patterns of drug consumption and laws that facilitated a black market but did nothing to really curb the trade, that resulted in 85 million Americans being forced to flee their homes? Well, that's what happened in Colombia. And yet, for all the violence, there were never more than 200,000 combatants in a country of 52 million people. So the vast majority of Colombians were just caught in the vice of war, innocent victims. The last year of war, before the Havana Agreement in 2016, the FARC, just one of the leftist groups, were down to 6,000 cadre, mostly teenagers looking for a meal. Yet they made $600 million from cocaine. So you give me the Rosedale Boy Scouts and $600 million US, and I can terrorize Southern Ontario. So, Colombia's been colored in this way, but the fuel of the war was always the consumption of cocaine. So in that sense, everybody's got blood on their hands who's used cocaine. And we all have a certain kind of obligation, I think, to the country. Despite that trauma, the country maintained civil society and democracy, greened its cities, created millions of acres of national parks, sought restitution with indigenous people, and has actually set itself up as the world falls apart and it falls together for a kind of a cultural and economic renaissance as, two generations of young people forced to flee the violence are returning from every capital of the world with skill sets in every endeavor. So Colombia is primed on the edge of a great phase in its history, mercifully at last.
So there's a number of really interesting lessons contained within the book. And as I was reading it, I was actually drawing back and forth between, to be honest, your Rolling Stone piece and this piece, because Colombia's been through so much, the colonization by the Spaniards and years of civil war and the drug war, and really what appears to be, I don't know enough to judge, horrible governance for almost its entire history. And yet the people...
That's actually not true.
Okay.
Colombia has a very enduring democracy. A democracy strong enough to have gone through this extraordinary period of violence that was brought on by the cocaine trade. And remember that, think of how the Americans are treating desperate women who arrive at their border from the south. in a quiet way, Colombia has accepted 1.4 million Venezuelan refugees, housed them, fed them, looked after them, schooled their children. So Colombia actually is a very strong and enduring democracy.
Okay.
Yeah.
My point was that, thank you for that. But my point was going to be the people are resilient.
Totally.
Right? People are resilient everywhere in the world, right? You can put them through horrible things and humanity will survive and they will find a way. I mean, Chris Arnaudy, who wrote the book Dignity, was on a few weeks ago talking about how people find dignity and social supports and culture in the most horrible circumstances in America. And even and the same is true in Colombia.
Well, I think
so we may go into a bad patch, but we're a resilient group of people.
And I think an interesting parallel is that, when you look at countries that are really torn asunder, Ireland, South Africa, Colombia, for that matter, peace comes generally not through military victory or political action, but through pure exhaustion, when the people themselves simply say enough. And in Bogota, for example, the capital of Colombia, 2 kids got on Facebook a few years ago and just started a campaign that 3 words, no más FARC, no more FARC, the leftist guerrilla group. And within 3 weeks, you had 2 million people marching to that slogan in the streets of Bogota. And I think the analogy to the States is apropos. This divide that is tormenting that country will not be solved by whoever wins in November. The divide is so much deeper than that. And until that divide in some way is bridged, it's very difficult to see America not continuing what appears to be a very long descent from a place of extraordinary achievement. And that's really what the Rolling Stone piece is all about. It's about the idea that epidemics and pandemics always have a way of shifting history. The Black Death, of course, changed the whole medieval order by killing half the people in Europe. But, the Spanish flu, for example, that killed millions of people in 1918, 1919, including my grandfather, who walked out in the streets of Calgary and was dead by the afternoon. It didn't have the same impact because it happened in a world already numb with death because of the Great War. In the summer of Woodstock, 100,000 people died of Hong Kong flu. In Berlin, they were storing corpses in subway stations. But again, we didn't have international digital communication. We didn't have international travel. It didn't have that impact. COVID's impact has not just been its rates of morbidity and mortality, but the comparative rates. Americans literally woke up to realize that their notion of exceptionalism was in tatters. They were, in fact, living in a failed state, ruled by a dysfunctional government, at the head of which was an individual who was advocating the use of bathroom disinfectants to treat a disease that he intellectually could not begin to understand. And as American frontline workers waited for emergency dispatches of fundamental medical supplies from Asia, the hinge of history kind of opened to the Asian century. Empires never anticipate their demise. Kingdoms are born to die. The 15th century belonged to the Portuguese, 16th to the Spanish, 17th to the Dutch, 18th to the French, 19th to the British. The British Empire reached its greatest geographical extent in 1935. Brits were swirling their gin and tonics in every corner of the world. We now know the empire was bled white and bankrupt by the Great War. And, America came out of the Second World War extraordinarily powerful. It went into the war demilitarized. In 1940, with Europe aflame, Portugal and Bulgaria had bigger armies. But within 3 years, we had 18 million people in uniform. We spat out Liberty ships by the hour. The record for building a Liberty ship was 4 days, 29 hours, and 17 minutes. We built B-24s by the hour. The Ford Motor Company produced more industrial output than did Italy. The Detroit Arsenal, run by Chrysler, made more tanks than the German Third Reich. It was just incredible, this wealth of industrial activity. And in the wake of the war, America dominated the global economy, 50% of the economy, 90% of the cars. And that allowed for a kind of a truce between capital and labor that gave us the middle class. When you and I were young, Dave, a man with a single salary in a family could raise a family, own a house, own a car, send his kids to good schools. That promise, that deal, that essential bond of what we would call fairness disappeared with globalization. And every working man and woman could see that globalization, though celebrated with iconic intensity, was nothing more or less than capital on the prowl searching for cheaper sources of labor. And so the social contract of the United States fell apart, even as a nation began to sort of intensely celebrate the cult of the individual, which was great for mobility and freedom that we enjoyed as kids in the 60s. But it also came at a price of social solidarity, the erosion of the family. And you can see the statistics today that are so dire on that front. And I think an important thing, one of the criticisms I've had of this Rolling Stone piece from Canadians has been that I'm too gentle on Canada in holding Canada up in contrast to the States. But the piece isn't about the status of Canada. It's really about the status of the United States. And for those who offer that critique, I just offer a single piece of information. On July 30th of this summer, when the Americans were announcing nearly 60,000, 59,629 cases of COVID, on that day, all the hospitals of British Columbia, and again, British Columbia, a metropolitan center, an Asian city, 2 hours north of Seattle, where the pandemic landed, dozens of flights coming in every day from Asia. We logically should have been hit hard. But on the same day that the Americans announced 60,000 new cases, in all of our hospitals, there were only 5 COVID patients. And so what something was working in Canada, and what I would argue what was working was our social contract. The fact that we don't see wealth as a currency accumulated by the lucky few, but the strength of social relations and the bonds of reciprocity that bind us in common purpose. That we don't see that our healthcare system serves everybody, serves the collective, not the individual, and certainly not those who view every hospital bed as if it's a rental property.
Exactly. Are there some threads in this America thing I can pull out with you just a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
What's your theory about, so if they reached sort of peak greatness as a country in the 50s, and that's our idealized version of them, the day JFK's elected president is sort of the idealized moment of the United States, what happened between then and now?
Well, first of all, particularly the far right kind of creates a fantasy of the 1950s, an image of America that never really existed, but has to sort of presume to have existed. The 1950s was no ideal period, certainly if you were a woman, if you were black or a gay person. And certainly in the intervening years, in this incredible social transformation, we've seen women go from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. And you're either comfortable with those changes or you're not. But when we do look back in the 1950s, economically, the country, in fact, resembled Denmark more than it does the America of today. The marginal tax rate in the 1950s was 90%. Now, that doesn't mean that rich people were paying that much, but that was the rate, and that sent a message to everyone that everyone pays. My father-in-law was CEO of Bell & Howell and Company, the camera manufacturer, in the 1950s. It was a big company then, but his salary was only 20 times that of a regular white-collared salaried employee of the company. Today, that ratio would be at least 400 times. Today, this disparity, even as the working class has lost the opportunity to have a middle-class life based on industrial wages and the Treaty of Detroit as it came into being, this wealth that allowed you to give the benefits, that allowed you to give the salaries, that's what created the weekend. That's what created a working class who felt they were part of America. Today, if you look at the statistics, 1% of Americans have $30 trillion of asset, whereas the bottom half of the population has more debt than assets. The 3 richest Americans have more money than the poorest 160 million. And now, the Irish Times said a really powerful line about COVID, that there've been many emotions expressed.
About pity.
Yeah, that's it. It's like we've heard everything about America, but we've never heard pity before. But indeed, when you have a fighter, a country that once spat out ships and fighter planes and bombers by the hour, can't manage to get basic supplies of swabs and a paper mask together. When you have a country that led the way in medical innovation, defeating polio and smallpox, and led by a person advocating the use of disinfectants. When you have a country that celebrated the freedom of information, Franklin, Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, as the essence of democracy, far more. Schools were more important to Benjamin Franklin than the Congress, because it was only an educated electorate that could really practice democracy. Now, that country ranks 45th in terms of press freedom, a nation that created a myth of the huddled masses. Of course, all these national myths are morality plays. They're moral guides. No one lives up to them, but they do represent what we aspire to. And now the country that, welcomed the huddled masses of the world is turning away desperate mothers at its frontier. I would go as far as say that those in favor of building a wall along the Mexican border are not only misguided and in many cases cruel, I maintain they're acting in a way that is treasonous. Because what is the definition of treason, Dave? It's when you betray the central core values that define your nation, that elevate your nation, that allow the people of your nation to reach, as Lincoln said, for the better angels of your nature. And I would go even further. When people in the States, don't wear masks, flaunting the medical authorities, when they gather on the beaches and the bars and conventions and so on, they're not showing strength. They're actually demonstrating the weakness of a people who lack the stoicism to endure the pandemic or the fortitude to defeat it. But
isn't this where leadership matters, Wade? Isn't this where leadership matters? And it feels to me like so much of the way the U.S. handled COVID would have been different with just changing one person. If you'd had a different president, there might have been a whole lot different.
I think, Dave, you're absolutely
right. But you make the case, as aberrant as Trump is, you make an interesting case in the Rolling Stone article that he's a symptom, not the disease. I'd like you to talk about that a little bit, because it does feel to me like his leadership is consequential in this.
Well, when I talk about social solidarity or social democracy, there's a sense that we're in it together. Now, before I address your question directly, let me just share an allegory with the audience that I think helps explain this. Again, not to say that Canada is perfect by any means, but if you get your groceries in a Safeway in Canada, whether it's in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Newfoundland, or Nunavut, you may not feel a peer with the person. You may have more education, less education, more wealth, less wealth, but you do feel that you're part of a wider project, a project called Canada. You don't, in the States, you don't really feel that. There's a kind of a racial, economic, educational chasm between you and the checkout person that's very difficult to bridge. And the reason for that is very simple. In Canada, that the checkout person is getting a living wage because of the unions. And in Canada that their kids probably go to the same public school as your kids, neighborhood-based, that are funded not by property taxes, which benefit the neighborhoods of the affluent, but by state grants that give every kid a fair and equitable chance to use education to get ahead. And of course, critically, the third is that they know that they know that if their kids get sick, they get exactly the same medical care as your kids and of the Prime Minister. And those three things woven together become kind of the fabric of social democracy in Canada. Now, so see, medicine, universal healthcare is not about medicine. It's about fairness. It's about sending a signal. I'll tell you a great story. My mom at 85, Dave, got a headache at 11 o'clock on a Sunday. By 1 o'clock, she was undergoing neurosurgery at the top hospital in Victoria. We raced out, my sister and I, and by the time we got there, she was in the ICU. Right beside her was a girl from a farm family in Manitoba, surrounded by a dozen family members, right, who happened to have the same condition, operated on that day by the same neurosurgeon, and he had saved 2 lives. Now, my sister's a prominent lawyer. I've done well. We could have paid for that service, but that farm family from Manitoba could have faced a choice between bankruptcy and the fate of their child. In Canada, we say that's not an option. That's not a choice that we allow our people to have to be confronting. And in Victoria, the Empress Hotel, the great Fairmont Hotel, had a policy then that every Canadian with a family member in ICU got a free room. So after the nurses kicked us out, we all poured into our vehicles and went back together to the bar at the Empress Hotel. Now, the family from Manitoba were fundamentalist Christians. They didn't drink, so I bought orange juice and apple juice all around, and my sister and I had a beer or a drink or whatever, and we toasted. But we didn't toast the survival of my
Mennonites are cheap dates.
Yeah, but we didn't toast, that our parents, my mom and their daughter had survived. We didn't toast the Empress for being so generous. We didn't toast even the nurses and the doctors saved. We toasted our country because it was our country that allowed this to happen. This moment when two families from very different economic and social backgrounds came together as one over the fate of their families. So in the States, that solidarity does not exist. It's almost as if the country doesn't believe in community. It doesn't believe in society itself. It's sort of everyone for themselves. No one deserves anything. And when I say that Trump is a symptom of the decay, voting is a kind of a sacred trust. And the greatest sign of the decline of America, in a way, is that in 2016, fully 62 million Americans decided, selfishly, frankly, to vote their grievances, to vote their indignation. They all knew, everybody knew, that Trump's only conceivable credential for the job was his willingness to validate their hatreds, validate their anger, and target their enemies, real and imagined. And you had 62 million. I'm not saying that they should have voted Democratic or voted Republican, but you have an obligation to the collective that says, I'm not going to just indulge myself and vote for this idiot because I'm mad. That's not democratic action. And I think that when you look at the successful social democracies, they are all the countries that did well as one could be expected in the COVID crisis. And I think you can't ignore the social solidarity, the trust in institutions, the trust in each other. And social democracy, the Americans always say, is communism light. It's nothing of the sort. As you well know, it's dynamic capitalist economy that just happens to target every tier of the society. And the Americans, it may be true that social democracy won't work in the States, but if so, that's kind of a stunning indictment and kind of an indication of what Oscar Wilde had in mind when he quipped that, the United States was the only country to go from barbarism to decadence without passing through civilization.
I don't see any hope that they would ever have a healthcare system the way that we do, because the debate isn't even about that in the States, and they still can't get it through. The argument is that the left makes in the States is simply that everybody should have health coverage, or that everybody should have health insurance. Nobody makes the argument that everybody should have the same health coverage, or that everybody should have the same health care. They're totally unprepared to make that argument even. So they're never going to end up where we are.
Well, and then when you think of the decline of nations, and I want to stress, that a lot of people have seen this article as a Canadian, critiquing the United States. I want to stress that I was born Canadian, but I'm also Colombian. I'm also Irish, and I became a naturalized American. My kids were raised in the States. I found my career in the States. I got my education in the States. I revere the United States of America. My father-in-law was almost U.S. president. My son-in-law serves in the U.S. military.
Who's that? Who's your father-in-law?
Senator Charles Percy. He was the.
Oh yeah.
He brought down Nixon. He was the one when Watergate happened. He and Barry Goldwater went over the White House and said, Nixon, you just got to come and tell the truth. Country's falling apart. We're in Vietnam. campuses on fire. Just say you made a mistake. And Nixon took him into the Lincoln bedroom and lied to them both. And that's why Barry Goldwater never went to Nixon's funeral. And my father-in-law was also, he had turned down the vice presidency that Nixon offered it to him because he backed Rockefeller that year. And when Agnew had to resign, the deal was kind of struck with Jerry Ford, who was an unknown congressman from Michigan, that he'd get the vice presidency if he didn't run for office in 1976. And then constitutionally, he becomes president when Nixon unexpectedly has to drop out. And my father-in-law went to the White House, Dave, 6 months later and said, Jerry, about that deal we had. And President Ford said, Chuck, I kind of like this job. And that was that.
That's how it ended.
But I'll tell you something you'll appreciate. My father-in-law got John Lennon his green card. That was one of his wonderful things he did.
I should be wearing my Sometime in New York City shirt today.
Yeah,
should be. Okay, so you write off the American era in a way. You're very fatalistic. You list all the, let me finish my thing. You list all the empires and how they all end, and that they all end, and you pretty strongly imply, if not explicitly state, that we're headed into the Chinese era or the Asian era, and that the American era is over. I can't accept that fatalistically. I feel a need to fight for America, a need to fight for American leadership in the world, and to fight for the West. America has been, from a Canadian perspective, an unbelievable force for good in the world, and certainly a force for our good in the world. And as a Canadian, if you care about the future of Canada, it can never be as good in an Asian-dominated world as it has been in an American-dominated world. So for both self-interested financial reasons and for values and moral reasons, don't we have to fight for the American empire?
I couldn't agree more, and I would love to be proven to be absolutely wrong in everything I've predicted. Look, the end of the American era is no time to gloat. It's no time to celebrate. At a period of international crisis of beyond imaginings, when civilization itself could have gone down a dark rat hole into horrors beyond anything we can imagine, American military might, together with Russian blood, saved civilization. I think of this piece I wrote in Rolling Stone, which I had no anticipation would go viral like this. I think of it more as a love letter. Dave, it's like a family intervention. The first thing you have to do is show the mirror to the face of the individual to see how far they've fallen. And that's the first step on the path of regeneration and rehabilitation. Look, as I say in the piece, if the hinge of history, as I write, opens to an Asian century dominated by China, believe you, me, and all of us will be missing the best years of the American era. China, a country that puts the Uyghurs in the concentration camps, that squashes democracy in Hong Kong, that has a social credit system that denies people the right to travel if they're not serving the orthodox needs of the Communist Central Party. A nation state that is literally hoovering up the resources of the world, establishing a military presence in all far reaches of the planet. This is not a future I want for my children. So I agree with you 100%. And I would love America to defy history and find another century. I love America, but I want an America of the Grateful Dead, of Walt Whitman, of Abraham Lincoln, and not of Donald Trump. The better angels of the nature. If you think about it, the first American president famously couldn't tell a lie. This one can't recognize the truth. If Abraham Lincoln celebrated charity for all and malice toward none, this troll of a man has inverted that into a belief that he celebrates, malice towards all and charity for none. Look, I think the removal of Trump will be incredibly cathartic. And one of the things that is indeed hopeful from history.
Really, because I'm so worried about election night and the aftermath of election.
I think there's a very, we can talk about that in a second. I just wanted to say that there, another dark period of American history that we often don't appreciate is the height of the McCarthy era. This is a time when the simple aspersion or suggestion of affiliation with the Communist Party could lead to the end of a career, be it in Hollywood or the diplomatic service or in any public endeavor. And we forget how powerful McCarthy was at his height, at his depths, to the extent that Eisenhower, the great hero of D-Day, the most popular president since Roosevelt, feared McCarthy to the extent that he did nothing to quell his rage. And then it just took one moment in one of those hearings for that long-forgotten senator to say those brave public words, "Sir, have you no decency?" And the whole artifice crumbled, and this alcohol-sodden troll of a man was dead within 6 months and long forgotten. So I think that, America has incredible capacity for regeneration, but it has to do something about the basic inequity. The election, whoever wins, Dave, in November, will not heal this divide, this economic disparity between the haves and the have-nots. I think that countries, to function, there has to be a basic sense of fairness. You can disagree with the party in power. You can violently disagree with certain policies, whether they're political policies, social policies, or economic policies. But you've got to feel that your voice can be heard. You've got to feel that you're part of something bigger than yourself. You can't feel that you're just a frustrated and a victim of forces beyond your control that are in fact having such an impact in your lives. I mean, look at the fact that Americans now consume 2/3 of the world's antipsychotic drugs. The largest cause of death for people under 50 is opioid addiction. This is a country where the average American youth has spent 3 years watching video games, contributing to an obesity epidemic that the Joint Chiefs of Staff call a national security crisis. I mean, look at a sporting event from the 1940s, Yankee Stadium, and I challenge you to find someone in that crowd overweight. Today, look at a sporting event in the United States, and I would challenge you to find someone who is not overweight or even clinically obese. In other words,
that's why jerseys are such popular apparel.
That's why the reason the suit has persisted is it hides men's bellies.
So can you help me think through something that I'm really struggling with? So I'm really, as are you, quite interested in the role that inequality and the hollowing out of the middle class is playing in these fissures in our society and in the weird political results we're getting, etc. And I've had people come on this podcast from all different ideological perspectives and expertises, including economists, and tell me that they now believe that free trade was a mistake, that globalized free trade has led to all of these social problems and perverted capitalism from what it was into what it looks like right now. My problem, and all of that intuitively makes sense to me. And my problem is that, as you illustrate in Magdalena, people have been trading as long as there have been people with different shit to have. And so trading is not, everything else I know, other than that these trade deals have not worked out well for us, is that not trading and hunkering down in a bunker makes the world a less rich and more dangerous place than openness.
I agree with you.
I'm struggling to get through this issue right now.
Well, I think, Dave, you're absolutely right. I mean, my father-in-law was an ardent free trader, and he was a free trader because he believed peace followed free trade. And there's no question that when you're economic, I mean, that was the whole vision that came out of Western Europe in the wake of the Second World War. The European Union eventually came out of economic agreements that began with fundamental agreements on issues like steel and coal between Germany and France. If you can bind together two economies, war between the two nations becomes more problematic and more of a threat to those in power in both countries. But we forget that there are elements of history. We all think all these things are caused by policy, that we can somehow do something about. But, history is like a river that flows beneath us, and we are never really aware of the current or its direction. And some things just happen. For example, who could have anticipated the fallout of the birth control pill in terms of the transformation of the lives of women? People wanted the birth control for a very specific purpose, but no one really saw that it would unleash this kind of sexual revolution as it did. Or something like, you and I are probably, I'm probably a little older than you, but, we probably are old enough, both of us, to have gone to really good public schools, right?
Yes.
But have you ever thought why those public schools were so good in the 50s? It's because the only thing women were allowed to do was be nurses, secretaries, or teachers. So women that are now running corporations, acting as surgeons, in government, serving on the bench, They
were your math teacher.
They were our math teacher in grade 2. So, so part of this is, and again, if trade has been the lubricant of peace, and it fundamentally has, education has always been the vehicle for social mobility. Dave, I came out of British Columbia. I ended up going to Harvard because I was fighting forest fires, and there were a bunch of American draft dodgers. And they would tell our bosses to piss off, and we were too obedient, and they were just irresistible. And one had the Harvard student strike issue of the Life magazine. I thought, well, you go to the school like this to be cool like these guys. I turned up in Boston. I didn't know where Harvard was. Someone served me an artichoke. I had never seen an artichoke. I started to eat the thing. I thought, what do these Americans eat? And then they all started dipping it in this yellow sauce, and I didn't know what to do. And I'm being Canadian. I'm too proud. I'm 17. Oh, in Canada, we eat the whole thing. So I ate this damn artichoke, and I suffered for a week. My point is that I went to Harvard, not knowing the difference between Karl Marx and the Marx Brothers. And yet education transformed me. And yet, if we look across the United States, even as we celebrate and export our educational ideas, I could name you 15 cities that can't graduate half their senior high school class, from Detroit to Boston to Washington to San Francisco. Look at what we pay school teachers in Canada as well as the United States. I mean, my daughter teaches French immersion to grade 1 kids, and I can tell you, they've never been a luckier set of kids. And, she sings like a nightingale. She's sung in front. She's a great rock and roller. She's unbelievable. And she's so full of life, but her salary wouldn't allow her to leave, you know how it goes. And we've got to, you've got to invest in the things that can actually make a difference for your society. Look, since 2000, the Americans have spent at least $6 trillion in wars that have only done them harm. Through those years, they've never been at peace. China's never been at war. China built up its own infrastructure, pouring more cement in 3 years, every 3 years since 2000, than America poured in the entire 20th century. If you tick off the signs of the decline of empires, from the Romans to the Mongols, unnecessary foreign adventures, internal corruption and decadence. It goes on and on and on and on. I remember my youngest daughter was studying the fall of the Roman Empire at this posh private school in Washington, and she had to sort of memorize the 50 reasons Rome fell. And I was helping her do her homework one night, and I felt like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. I kept going, remember that scene with Annie McDowell, like, what does she want in the man? And he keeps going, check. Well, as we went through the reasons that Rome fell, I'm sitting there on the sofa going, check, and I'm getting scared to death because my daughter's studying Rome, but I'm thinking America.
We don't have lead poisoning, though, do we?
Well, if Trump's way with so-called regulatory reform, I mean, he's a president who would promote lead paint just for the hell of it.
Absolutely. Hey, you know what? You're so generous. We're almost out of time. Can I just slip back to Magdalena for a couple of quick questions?
Sure.
First thing is that one of the things we care about on this podcast is Indigenous peoples and the situation that Indigenous people are in Canada and have always been in Canada. And That's a culture that I'll just say, for fear of getting crapped on, I'll just say that's a culture we don't really respect in Canada. We don't think it has much value, that culture. And I will say of myself that consider myself a science rational person. I don't believe things unless scientific authorities have agreed they're true and documented them. Yet you, in the course of your time in Colombia, some of it's documented, I think particularly of the Xenu story, if I'm saying that correctly, about a lot of indigenous wisdom that's out there that maybe our modern world could value or learn from. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I never celebrate the exoticism of the other, sort of indulging in kind of hippie ethnography, but, indigenous people throughout the world tend to interact with the natural world based on reciprocity, a fundamental idea that the earth owes you a living, but you owe your fidelity to the earth. We have, because of our unique intellectual tradition going back beyond, but certainly in Descartes, when he said that all existed as mind and matter, in a single kind of gesture, he deanimated the world. And the idea that the earth could have a life force, or that the flight of a bird could have meaning, was sort of reduced as ridiculous, ridiculed as ridiculous. And so for the, it made for a different way of thinking about the planet. The planet becomes just a stage set upon which only the human drama unfolds. Now, this has a real impact on how people are raised to believe. If I'm, for example, from my tradition, I was raised to believe that a mountain's a pile of rock ready to be mined, a forest is cellulose and void of feet, ready to be fallen. That made me very different than my godchildren in Peru, who believe that a mountain is an Apu deity that will direct their destiny, or my brothers amongst the Kwakwaka'wakw here in British Columbia, who believe that the forest is the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven, and the cannibal spirits that have to be embraced during the Hamatsa ritual. Now, the issue isn't who's right and who's wrong, it's how the belief system mediates the relationship between a people and the land with very profoundly different consequences. If I think a mountain's a pile of rock, I tear it apart without thinking. If I think it's a deity, well, maybe I don't. And, one of the things that's come from the realm of science is a realization that we do indeed. In fact, one of the messages of COVID, surely, is that we are, in fact, biological beings on a living planet. And we saw very hopefully in the wake of COVID, the incredible resilience of the natural world. If you took the history of the Earth and made it a 24-hour clock, the entire existence of our species, including our progenitors, would be less than 1 second. So the Earth will endure, life will continue. It's whether or not there will be life for us in that sense. Now, in terms of indigenous people, I think it's important that we don't beat up on ourselves. History plays with a short deck, and, we have the capacity to change. The First Nations were footnotes of Canadian society in the lifetime of my father. Now they're not. We're engaged in an active treaty process here in British Columbia, which has extraordinarily the support of the Canadian people. Now, can you imagine if Obama had gone out to New Mexico to treat nation to nation with the Navajo? He'd be pilloried. Sure. Now, similarly in Colombia, when I was a kid, when I was first rambling around Colombia, Dave, and visiting the elder brothers, the sun priests, of the Arhuacos and the Kogi, the direct descendants of the Tairona civilization, never conquered by the Spanish, still ruled by a ritual priesthood, who literally believed that their prayers and rituals maintain the cosmic balance of the world. They call themselves the elder brothers and dismiss those of us who have ruined the world, they see it, as the younger brother. Well, when I would go visit them in 1974, the parents of my friends would say to me in Colombia, ¿Por qué quiere vivir con la gente sucia? Why do you want to live with the dirty people? Now, the last 5 Colombian presidents, as a first act of office, with the exception of Duque, have gone to pay homage to the mamos, the priests who have emerged as a sign of continuity and hope. In 1985, a Colombian president, Virgilio Barco, said to a friend of mine, Martin van Hildebrand, a great anthropologist to whom I dedicate the new book, Magdalena. And he said, Martin, do something for the Indians, as he put it. And in 5 incredible years as head of Indian affairs, Martin did more than something. He secured legal land tenure to an area of land of the Colombian Amazon, the size of the United Kingdom, and that those land rights were codified in perpetuity in the 1991 Constitution of the country. And behind a veil of isolation created by the trauma of modern Colombia, a whole new dream of culture was born. And the missionaries were thrown out. And I remember Martin and I were making a film. We asked some of the elders, why did you allow these missionaries to be with you for so long when their goal was to transform your lives, your culture, your beliefs? And they said to us, because they promised to make us human. And that, of course, is the essence of colonization, to persuade the colonized of their own inherent inferiority. But Colombia has done extraordinary. I mean, it's not a perfect place. Certain indigenous groups are still in conflict with the state. But in absolute numbers, there are many native people alive today in Colombia as there were in absolute numbers at the time of the conquest. And indigenous people no longer are seen as a threat to the nation state, but as a credit to it. No longer seen as an embarrassment, but an asset for any state that is prepared to accept diversity. Look what's happened here in Canada. I mean, the Inuit people reached a low point in that incredible clash of cultures that happened between 1930 and 1960. And yet now we have Nunavut, this extraordinary homeland, which has become a symbol of hope for indigenous people around the world. So, we have to give ourselves, as you suggested earlier, Dave, the possibility of change, the promise of new hope. We can't rob from the future, the dream of a better way of living on the earth.
That's pretty profound, and I want to thank you for sharing that. And that's so heavy, I just feel the need to end on a somewhat lighter note, which is, sure. And I have to ask you this because, I'm an aging boomer rock and roller type. So the book left me thinking that I should be importing coca leaves and carrying them around in my pockets and chewing them all day instead of drinking endless cups of coffee. But I know that you've gone deeper, and I know that you are one of the world's experts on the hallucinogenic properties of plants all over the world, but particularly in Colombia. So what's the best natural high in Colombia?
Well, I would say coca. Coca is to cocaine what potatoes are to vodka. It's an adage of pharmacology that the purer the drug, the greater the potential for abuse. The first morphine addict was the wife of the man who invented the hypodermic syringe. I mean, tobacco only became true. Tobacco only became dangerous with the invention of the cigarette. Before that, you couldn't really inhale tobacco into the lungs until they had mild strains of Virginia tobacco. The fascinating thing about coca is that the efforts to eradicate coca fields began in the modern era in the 1920s, 50 years before there was a cocaine problem. And as physicians in Lima looked up into the mountains of the Andes and saw poor nutrition, illiteracy, what they saw to be social pathologies of one sort or another, there had to be a culprit. And since issues of land distribution and economic injustice challenged too closely the bourgeois foundations of their own lives, they settled on coca as a source of all evil. And yet through all those years and all those attempts, vain as futile as they were, to eliminate the fields, nobody did a nutritional study of the plant until we did it for the USDA in the 1970s. And what we found horrified our backers at the US government. Yes, the raw coca leaf has a tiny amount of cocaine hydrochloride in it. And again, cocaine itself is not in and of itself an evil substance. It's still our most important topical anesthetic for nose, throat, and ear surgery. There's no such thing as good and bad drugs. There are good and bad ways of using drugs. And coca leaf is a good way of using that stimulant. It has perhaps half to 1% dry weight, absorbed benignly in the mucous membrane of the mouth, a completely benign stimulant in a harsh environment, but it also is chock full of vitamins. So when the mamos use their coca, they absorb through the leaves the daily requirement of vitamins of a modern medical recommendation. The plant has more calcium than any plant ever studied by science, making it perfect for a diet that traditionally lacked a dairy product. It even has enzymes which enhance the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, making it perfect for the potato-based diet. So this is a plant that's been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, revered, as they say, as the divine leaf of immortality by every pre-Columbian civilization going back 4,000 years. And right now, there is no way the farmers of Colombia are going to stop growing coca. It's 1,000 times more lucrative than growing any other crops. So what we need to do is break coca off from cocaine and give the farmers a legal market for their product. And we have to create a nutraceutical market whereby people around the world, either as a chewing gum or some kind of more palatable administration device or method, will be able to actually benefit from this substance. It is so much better for you than tea or chocolate, let alone coffee, but it's on that level of stimulation. It's so mild that you don't even have any sense of anything but a gentle sense of well-being and the capacity to focus at tasks. So the person who can crack that nut, I mean, think about this. Look at marijuana. I mean, marijuana is called dope for a reason.
I do from time to time.
I mean, but
what?
Who wants to be mellow? Mellow means a state of overripe fruit. Here's a bizarre thing. Timothy Leary was put into San Quentin Federal Penitentiary, put into solitary confinement for months of his life for the crime of possessing a joint of marijuana. Now, a generation later, we're saying to school kids all around the country that marijuana is essentially benign. Go ahead. No, marijuana should be measured. Again, we should always measure drugs not by moral or political or social attitudes in the moment, but by their pharmacology. And marijuana is a powerful drug. You don't want people driving on marijuana. I don't want young people using marijuana when they should be full of life. What kid of 16 should be mellow? That's a state of overripe fruit. You want a kid so on fire they can't wait to get on in life. So my point is the way we've turned marijuana from something that could incarcerate a great scholar like Leary for no reason to something that we somehow are somewhat cavalier about isn't necessarily a sign that we've gone anywhere in awareness of the nature of drug use. You know, I mean, if we can allow marijuana to be used recreationally, gosh, coca leaves would absolutely transform the lives of people because it allows you to, in this most subtle way, stay focused on task. And that's what we all have to do, isn't it? Every day. We're all staring at laptop screens every day. And so coca would be literally a panacea. It would get people off coffee, get people probably off tobacco, and be a completely benign, mild stimulant that people could revere as people have revered in the Andes and Northwest Amazon for thousands of years.
I need to get my hands on this stuff, Wade.
Well, that's hard to do. I mean, it's completely legal in Colombia. It should be legal around the world. You know, the Peruvians and the Bolivians have entire national coca companies.
Hey, is it legal in Costa Rica?
Well, it's not found in Costa Rica. It's found in Colombia. Two species, Erythroxylon novogranatense, Erythroxylon coca, 4 varieties, Turiense and Ipadu. But it's mostly found in the northwest Amazon of Colombia, and then in Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. For some reason, it was eradicated in Ecuador at the time of the conquest. So it's mostly used just as a medicinal herb there in places.
Wade, I've abused your generosity of time. I want to thank you. You have the most fascinating career, and you have a shitload of accumulated wisdom. And I thank you for coming on the Herle Burly and sharing it with our listeners. I really appreciate that.
Well, thanks, Dave, so much. All the best.
All right, take care. Be well.
You too.
Yeah. So, last spring, around the same time as the pandemic was arriving in Canada, about 40,000 tons of rock and gravel came roaring down a mountain just north of Hope in British Columbia. Most of it ended up on a stretch of CN railroad track along the banks of the Fraser River. Then heavy rain dumped another half meter of dirty snowmelt on top of it. The mess that CN's crews found when they arrived was simply epic. Most people would have taken one look and given up. But CN's geotechnical engineer took a look and put his team to work. 5 days later, trains were rolling along that track again. The fact is, a company that's basically the major veins and arteries of Canada's cardiovascular system has to be ready for any emergency. CN triggered its pandemic response plan back in January, when the rest of the world was just beginning to take the disease seriously. CN support staff gathered to mix homemade sanitizer and assemble protective kits for the men and women who work out on the rails. And the vast majority of the company's workforce never stopped reporting for work. Because if the railroad stops, well, so does the economy. Simple as that. CN might run mostly out of sight, through forests and along rivers and over mountains, in places Gordon Lightfoot called too silent to be real. But it's the very definition of an essential service. Here we are, folks, back on the pod, the political panel. Hello, Scott. Hello, Jenny.
Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hello. How are we today?
Miserable. Uptight.
Why? What's
Well, it's
wrong?
the first day of drop-off. The whole goddamn morning has been a Marx Brothers film. So anyway, a Marx Brothers film with a tinge of tragedy to it because, I'm taking my oldest son, not my oldest, youngest son. I got a lot of sons. You know what I mean? I'm like a school board. I have sons in cohorts, right? I have the older cohort, the 22 and the 17-year-old and the 18-year-old, and then I've got the younger cohort, the 11 and the 7-year-old. So the 11-year-old starts today in the public school system. The 7-year-old starts on Thursday. So today was like managing, the 11-year-old off, and you got to drop him at the edge of the property. You can only go to a certain time. You must wear a mask. You can't come on the property. He's got to find his cohort, present the credentials. He's got like letters of transit that are signed by me that declare that he's had no cough or anything like that. Then he has to go and get his temperature checked. And then he needs to find his teacher.
Wait a second, at that age, I couldn't hold on to my keys.
Yeah, it's all going to work out. He's going to learn a lot today, I'm sure. He'll come home with new knowledge. But, I want all of this to happen, and I want him to be safe. But it was a stressful, unhinged morning. And now I'm late to record the pod, and I'm perspiring, and it's just, it's a tough day.
Jenny's been waiting impatiently, but before that, she did say she was in a good mood.
I actually was waiting very patiently, Scott.
You look like Yvonne DiCarlo.
What does that mean?
The Munsters, you've got the straight,
Wow.
Sexy Munster mom look going, like the straight, dark hair.
I was in a good mood, Scott. Now I'm ready to fight.
That's a compliment. She was a fox. She was undead, but she was an undead fox. Okay. Don't you remember John Aston? Ba-ba-boom! Come on.
I'm in Toronto.
Weird.
I think we all are today.
I am in Toronto for the first time in 6 months. It's weird out there. There's people and cars and
English being spoken.
And presumably COVID. It's all very intimidating.
Well, you live on that little park where people congregate. So, you're literally like you're in a COVID bubble. You're like right on it. You just have to open your door and take a good hard suck of air, and you're boom hospitalized.
Pretty much. Then maybe that's why Terry's wearing a mask every time I'm around. Hey, look, I can't, since I'm home and I'm in my upstairs study, I got to brag about this. I was bragging to Jenny about it earlier. Scott, you see that guitar. You know that guitar.
I know the story of this guitar, you bet.
Yeah. That guitar behind me, that Ovation acoustic guitar, is the guitar that the great Bernie Taupin wrote all of Elton John's lyrics on, up to and including the reworking of Candle in the Wind for Princess Diana, and then put it up for auction. And I have it. So there's my...
It's very cool.
It's very, very cool. Speaking of cool, I have a book today.
Okay.
Because I'm back in Toronto and I've got more access to my books. I've got a book today. Scott will have read this. I don't know if Jenny has read this. It's called Grits. It's by Christina McCall Newman. Grits, an intimate portrait of the Liberal Party. I read this voraciously when it came out in about 1980. And for the Liberal Party, if you're interested in the Liberal Party as an institution, this is the Old Testament. This is the bang-on story of how the Liberal Party operated from the 60s through to the 80s, with deep, in-depth profiles on the people who made it what it was, from Lester Pearson to Pierre Trudeau to Michael Pitfield and Jim Coates. So it's a hell of a story. And anybody that wants to understand where the Liberal Party came from, this is the book. This is the book to read.
Can I give you a story about that book quickly?
Sure.
Related to that book? So in the early 1990s, she and her then husband, no longer Peter C. Newman, who, by the way, is one of the all-time biggest pricks on earth, she and her new husband, Stephen Clarkson, I believe they've both passed now. They wrote a biography. Remember, they wrote a 2-volume biography of Pierre Trudeau.
Yeah, he haunts us still.
He haunts us still is the opening line of the first volume. So I was hired. I was working at that time as a consultant, and I was hired to do the book promotion by the book publishers, to work with Christina McCall and Stephen Clarkson, do the book promotion in and around Ottawa, trying to pick up on the Ottawa, Parliament Hill, political zeitgeist and interest in the book. And we did all sorts of events. And I had to travel around with them around the country and stuff. And I admired that book. I loved Grits. They were not what I would call the kindest people on the planet. They didn't. I'm trying to find the right word for it. They didn't like me. That's what the word was, right? They did not like me at all. And I thought that I was being wonderful and polite and professional and working hard. But they managed to identify all of my faults and raise them constantly. And I found it very tough. We did a big promotion in the reading room on Parliament Hill, and Luba Goy came, but she was 45 minutes late. She got trapped in a rain shower. She stood on a stage with yellow sheafs of paper. She'd written jokes in a cab when she's dripping wet, and she's reading them. And I think she might have had 7 to 8 bottles of wine before she stepped immediately on stage. And she's like reading jokes going, "And so I said to Pierre, how about that rose?" And everyone's just like, fucking crickets, man, right? Parliament Hill crickets. Anyway, so they didn't like that event. They were very upset. We sold some books, and I never spoke to them again after that. I hope I think they're both passed away. If not, I hope they're doing well.
So, speaking of books, there's a big book came out since we last met. Bob Woodward has another one of his tell-all exposés out. I don't understand how this guy operates anymore. Like, he made his name in Watergate by the deepest sleuthing and investigative journalism you can imagine. And now he just goes to people and they tell him shit. Like, seemingly he just sits down with people and they just run their mouths. So he's got the easiest job going. But this book is obviously brutal for Trump. If anything mattered in the world anymore, this would be brutal for Trump. The question is, he sat down for 18 interviews, 9 hours of interviews that are taped. So to those people on this panel who have advised leaders of countries on communications initiatives, why would a person agree to sit down with Bob Woodward?
I can't think of one. I can't think of one reason. If I was working for Trump or any politician and they came and said, "I'd like your advice, going to sit down with Woodward, going to record all the conversations, seemingly not negotiate any form of parameters around the interviews or how to use," because you know, for people that don't deal with media, and I never did while I was in the PMO. It wasn't until after I left government. You know, when you're having conversation, I don't know what you guys are like, but I have media that I consider I'm very friendly with, and every conversation I have with them, it starts with, "Oh, by the way, this is like off the record," even if the conversation is mostly like, you know, "How was your summer vacation?" or what have you, to the point where some of them go, "Come on, Jenny, you know it's off the record." But it's just it's a way that politicians and people that speak to the media have to protect themselves in terms of these relationships. So I can't think for a minute what benefit would have been for Trump on this. That being said, I don't think the average American voter is paying attention to the Woodward book. I don't think they're watching CNN for the wall-to-wall coverage of this, or the daily outrage on Twitter. But it doesn't stop that this was not the best of communications exercise leading into an election year.
I was listening to Hacks on Tap, the podcast by David Axelrod and Mike Murphy, and they were talking about this. Well, actually, Axelrod wasn't on. It was Robert Gibbs in place of Axelrod. They were talking about this, and Gibbs said that when he was writing one of his Obama books, that Gibbs and Axelrod went to talk to him. He was asking for access to Obama, and they went to talk to him about about the terms. And so he invites them over for dinner, and he lays on this beautiful spread, and they're sitting down to dinner. And Gibbs said that after dinner, they realized how much information they had given him, how much he had extracted from them over the course of dinner. And at the end of it, they agreed to 1 hour for Obama.
Well, I'll say two things. One, the direct answer to your question of why would any president, why would any presidential team, why would anyone surrounding a president agree to sit down and take part in a book by Bob Woodward? I think that the explicit answer to that question is hubris and fear. And I'll start with fear. The fear part is Woodward, with all of his authority, love it, Woodward, with all of his authority, says, I've already spoken to 22 people that were in a room with 21, and I'm told the following things about you. And out of sheer panic, these people take part because they say, well, it's Bob Woodward. He is going to write something that will become a matter of record. It will form the first chapter of the history of this discussion. And if I don't play ball, then I'll be the ball. So that's the first thing. And I think you see people do that over and over and over again. By the way, their fears are probably exaggerated. They probably could get away with saying, go fly a kite, and maybe not suffer the consequences they fear. That's the first thing. The second thing is hubris over and over again. It's Bob Woodward. If you're Robert Gibbs working for Obama as his communications director, you grew up, right, watching All the President's Men, reading those books, steeped in the lore of Bob Woodward. He invites you to his home to talk to you. Like, you're overwhelmed. And the hubris part of it is, I'm caught up in this. I'm now part of this world. This is a demonstration and evidence that I'm part of this world. And now I'm going to charm him and position myself perfectly in this book. And maybe you do, or maybe you don't. But there's a long string of people that have cooperated on his books, and he's ended up just slaughtering them. And, go back to 1983 with Wired, his biography of John Belushi. To this day, Jim Belushi says, if I see that motherfucker, I'll rip his cocksucking head off. Like, that's what he says about him. I think that's a direct quote. So, it's pure hubris on the part of Trump to believe that he can charm Woodward and turn it into a good thing for him. But the only thing I would say, and this sounds like I'm weirdly saying it in Trump's defense, and I am, he's not the first president, and he's not the first person around a president to make this mistake in the last 40 years. Woodward has played this card over and over and over again.
Yeah, which is stunning. To Scott's point, though, it meeting with him has not helped anyone that has met with him, and we're not talking about a 1 hour Obama interview. We're talking 18 hours, like 9 sit downs. It's if the purpose was, if Trump thought he could charm Woodward or try to change the story, it's completely off brand from how Trump actually has been conducting himself. Because a Donald Trump, one would guess, to say, okay, well, let him write his fucking book, and I'll just go out and do my campaign stump speech will basically just be disparaging Woodward, his writing, his ex-wives, his kids, his dog, like that ultimately would have been. So it was a very different decision as to why he decided to sit down for not one, but 17 more hours in terms of trying to defend his. But
that's because if the rest of us have
tape,
right?
What's that about?
But that's because if the rest of us suffer from hubris, then obviously Trump suffers from Olympian level hubris, right? So that's the obvious explanation for it. Plus, I'm with Jenni, and I think you, David. in a real world, this would be very consequential. Coming on the heels of his comments about generals, you put these two things together, you'd think it's really consequential. At most, the consequence is that he chews up 4, 5, 6, 8 days talking about this and not talking about trying to get the economy back on track, and maybe that deters and keeps him 7, 8, 9, 10 points behind Biden. But I don't think it actually harms. I don't think it alters opinion on the guy. Nothing alters an opinion on this guy. You have a view on him already.
Yeah, no, I don't think it has any electoral consequence whatsoever.
Jenny,
which is astonishing.
Did Mr. Harper ever agree to, I'm trying to think of the books that were written about him. Did he ever, did he participate in Paul Wells' book?
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah, and we
the
were
odd
asked.
Canadian example, Scott, and you brought it up the other day when we were chatting, is, of course, Brian Mulroney and Peter C. Newman, the aforementioned Peter C. Newman.
Who, as I mentioned earlier, is a prick, and I think that's one of the prime examples of it. I think that he did far worse than Woodward. If you listen, and those have tapes as well, right? That book has tapes with it.
Yep.
And if you listen to those tapes, I think that you can make a case that Peter C. Newman was, you can say everybody in this conversation's a grown up and fair's fair. But I think he was really sucking Mulroney in and explicitly misleading about what the nature of the book was going to be, what his perspective on Mulroney in the book was. I think it was it's uncomfortable to listen to the tapes, not because of what Mulroney says, but because of what Newman says.
But that's why politicians shouldn't be doing these kind of books anyways. If politicians want to write any form of, you've seen former prime ministers like Harper wrote a book on geopolitics. They should write their own stories. I'm not sure why sitting down with a journalist, they think it's going to be any different than they're not when they're not prime minister. If you remember, David, when you interviewed Bob Fife, I thought he was very much like, unlike other reporters, he basically said, I'm not friends with any of these politicians. I've never gone for a drink with them. I've never had them to my house. I don't go over to their homes. We're not friends. And I think that actually, and it might be a bit more of an old school thing. And as someone that never, like Scott, your job was, you had to deal with media people. I happily would walk through the foyer of the House of Commons and no one would have a clue who I was. So that was good. But I just think it's time and time again, politicians, whether they're current or retired, they make these same mistakes in thinking that all of a sudden now because they're gone, all of a sudden these journalists have become their best friends. And it's never going to be the case. We're adversarial in what we do by nature.
Even the ones that you consider friends, Jenny, and I have a lot that fall into that category, it's still wise not to tell them anything terribly newsy.
Yeah, well, it's like I said, I have friends, but that's their job. That's, as I said, I have friends who I quite enjoy getting together and having a coffee with, and see them at social events and parties. But I still, if I'm having a conversation, I still start it with, this is on background, this is off the record, like not for attribution.
That's a good practice. That is a best practice because, sometimes people will make you feel awkward for doing that. Oh, come on, Jenny.
Doesn't it ruin the mood? It's like a prenup, isn't it?
It does. But you know what? The time you don't do it is the time you're standing around with Lawrence Martin, and then the next morning you get up and you're Peter DeNolo, and the headline is Chrétien hates Queen and wants to annul the. Remember that? Peter's told that story. That's a hilarious story. He wakes up, he's chatting, he's having a little conversation at a coffee shop or someplace with Lawrence Martin. He thinks 2-second exchange with him. The next day there's a headline that says Chrétien wants to abolish the monarchy. Peter has to gather the Ottawa Citizen up and run over to 24 Sussex. Sir, I need to meet you before breakfast. Chrétien's like, I don't like the Queen. I don't care. Who cares? That is funny. I hope you shit your pants, Peter. Anyway, I'm telling Peter's story. That's not fair. I have many, many, many worse stories than that where I've screwed up. So,
yeah. Yeah. Jenny probably appreciated it. But anyway.
That might be fair.
So I've got a lot of election talk I want to talk about with us today. Let's start with New Brunswick. They had one last night. The Premier, Blaine Higgs, won big, re-elected with a majority.
Yep.
The Greens did very well, I thought, in English New Brunswick.
They kept the three seats they had. The People's Alliance kept 2 out of the 3 seats they had.
The Greens ran ahead of the Liberals in many southern ridings. And so there could be something problematically going on there. Vickers ran on the Liberal leader, Kevin Vickers, ironically, was the even though Blaine Higgs is a pretty conservative guy, Vickers was the austerity candidate in the
his message was very muddled. Like his message was things are just so terrible, but could never really put his finger as to. He literally was just picking the exact opposite of what Higgs was saying. And it actually speaks to a guy who had no background in partisan politics, no background in politics, had become a inflated celebrity because he led everyone to believe that he was the hero on Parliament Hill.
He saved Stephen Harper's life. This is correct, is it not?
He did not. Despite him walking into the Conservative caucus and said, I got him, he actually did not. It was an RCMP officer from Labrador City, Newfoundland and Labrador that actually...
Maybe he'll be the next premier of Newfoundland, that guy.
Well, he made him the ambassador to Ireland for some reason. I mean, we don't need to tear down Kevin Vickers for Pete's sake. He performed pretty admirably that day, I'd say.
Okay, well...
Don't you think? What?
What do you mean he performed?
She's telling us a story about how the guy claimed to...
I meant on Capitol Hill. I meant on Parliament Hill.
I just told the story about he went and lied and said he killed the terrorist, and he didn't.
Wow. Okay.
And by the way, that's just not me saying it. It actually came out.
No, that's a matter of public records.
It came out in 2016, and the poor RCMP officer that did it, he basically was relegated from any form of history, just basically revoked from anything that had happened. But we knew about it the day after the RCMP. It was an RCMP.
Give the guy his due. His name is Barrett, isn't it?
Chris Barrett.
Chris Barrett. There's the guy.
Okay. I'm not trying to run down Barrett or take anything away from him, but
not
Vickers still showed courage, did he not? I mean, my gosh, he was running around with a gun, chasing a guy with another gun, wasn't he?
Bibeau was killed within 30 seconds of coming into Parliament Hill, 30 seconds to a minute. I digress because I was actually.
You know what? I don't know. I'll bail out. I'm sorry.
Wow.
Wow, Vickers needed you in the last 30 days. He didn't have as strong an advocate in New Brunswick as you.
But all this to say is, so here's a guy. So he was born and raised in Miramichi, which the seat he ran in, Miramichi, was actually one of the People's Alliance seats, which is essentially an English rights. It's essentially the new and improved core party, so to speak, the Confederation of Regions.
New and improved.
but here's a guy who decided, because he had no background in politics, and I assume was arrogant and believed that I'm Kevin Vickers, ergo I'm going to go to my hometown and I'm going to run and I'm going to win. And he lost by a significant amount, close to 20% of the vote, where he could have picked seats in Moncton or even Fredericton or in Oromocto. The Liberals only lost by 1 percentage point, 93 votes in the 2018 campaign. So there was no strategy given to that. And I think, rightfully he resigned, and the Liberal Party is going to have to What?
Well, Jesus Christ, you're kicking the living shit out of the guy. He lost his own seat. He lost the election. Now you're saying that the thing we know
he was terrible. He was terrible. He was a terrible leader.
Yeah, but lots of people say, okay, well, I think I'm going to come.
So what am I supposed to? So what? Should he get a green ribbon for participation?
No, maybe. But I'm just saying, wow, you're really putting the boots to him.
Jenni makes a good point about the writing choice, because I can tell you that when I go back to lead the Saskatchewan Liberal Party, I am, despite being from Prelate, not going to run in the riding of Cypress Hills grasslands, because I will get 7% of the vote in that riding.
Well, 5% unless you cut your hair.
I did cut my hair, Scott. This is a new and improved hair. This is a cut.
Okay, sure thing, David Crosby.
What do we take from the fact that a government called an election in the middle of the pandemic and won a majority?
What do you think, Jenni? I'm really curious about this.
Well, so I think it actually shows that people right now are happy with the performance of the government, regardless of political stripes. I think you see it in numbers in BC the same. That's why Horgan is musing about the writ. We're hearing the writ could drop as early as this weekend or next week. I think people are generally happy with the performance of government. I think they don't want they're afraid of a lot of change, and it also shows that there's no backlash in terms of having an election. People are comfortable with it. There's, there was a different kind of election. There was no door knocking. It was only distribution of literature by mail, is my understanding.
60% turnout.
Yeah, which New Brunswick always has a higher than normal turnout. I think the last election was 67% or something. Them and PEI are always higher than it seems like the provincial national average. But I think it just shows that people are fine having an election. And right now they don't want a lot of change because, as we have talked about, there has been no serious ramifications to people's economic lives. I think people are still scared of the pandemic, which I think is brought on by politicians. But my views are well known on that. We can get into that, but I think people are genuinely scared. I think you've got people worried about their kids going back to school, like Scott and his boys. And I think people, as I said, the economic ramifications of COVID have not fully been hit by people. And I think that governments are wanting to get the elections out of the way before the next round of layoffs happen.
So let's pick up on that, because I agree with that. I agree with that completely. So New Brunswick just had an election.
I'm not sure I do.
Wait a second. Okay. Saskatchewan is going to have an election. That's happening. BC is likely to have an election. Why wouldn't everybody have one, including the feds?
You get a car. You get an election. Okay. So I'm gonna sound like I'm really talking out of my ass because I agree with you guys that now is the best moment, I think, for Trudeau to have an election. Like if I was working for him, I would be advising him strongly, make this moment the election, because I would rather run on if your analysis and your prescription is well chosen, then I'd rather run on its promise than on its reality 8-9 months from now, after that, plus a whole pile of other things you can't control intervene. So I'm all for going now if I was Trudeau. But I'm not sure. I hesitate a little bit because you guys, I don't know much about New Brunswick politics, as our discussion of Kevin Vickers just graphically illustrated, but it seems to me that it is so defined by the language divide in that province. It's a pretty unique electoral place. And I don't know that you can immediately translate the indifference to calling an election in the midst of COVID there, and assume that will apply everywhere else. Now, maybe if it to me, BC is super interesting. If it doesn't bite them in BC, that will be interesting. But I'm really looking at Ontario, and I'm thinking we've got schools reopening, we see cases reopening, cases rising. You're starting to hear warnings from people in the medical sector talking about increasing hospitalization rates. So, I don't know. I wonder if there's a bigger penalty in Ontario than there might be elsewhere in terms of people saying, no, you got your priorities screwed up. I still think you should go. So I know I'm talking against myself.
If COVID took over the federal campaign, let's just say that that there was a resurgence and COVID took over the federal campaign, and that's like the worst case scenario for having called an election.
Right.
Would that be bad for the Liberal Party, given how well they are perceived to have handled the first wave?
Well, it might not be good if it's if it undoes the good and the money you put in the bank from the last 6 months. If people say, well, now what I see is that you're trying to prostitute that performance, that your priority is not me, that health and well-being is not what occupies you, and instead you're looking to cash in electorally and increase your power. So, I mean, it could cause harm. I don't think that will happen. All I'm saying is I'm trying to make one specific point, which is that I'm not sure that the electoral dynamic in New Brunswick is necessarily replicating itself in all parts of the country. And in particular, I wonder about Ontario and Quebec.
Yeah, but the difference is Ontario, they're not minority parliaments. So there's a lot better, there is a lot more compelling communications exercise for governments if you've got over half the opposition that are disagreeing with different handling of whether it's financial or whether it's health related. In Ontario and Quebec, you've got majority governments. So it's not like Doug can say, over half of the legislature disagrees with how I'm handling X, Y, and Z, and I need a further mandate from the people. He has a majority mandate. Scott Moe's going because Scott Moe has no choice. It's fixed election dates.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just saying in federally, I think that, forget about Doug Ford. Doug Ford might campaign for the Liberals, for Pete's sake, the way we see him going these days. But I'm just saying, I think I can understand why some are cautious. I can understand why those Ontario MPs say, whoa, it's going to feel like I'm going to be forced to really do a pivot and say, yeah, no, my only concern is your concern, and now I'm going to ask you for my job back.
Well, they're really going to enjoy it a year from now then. They're really going to enjoy it a year from now. Because,
and that's the point that I find convincing.
It's going to be great out there. I already think that the politics of COVID is shifting. I can feel it. I can feel that as this second wave is gathering steam in the country, that people are not reacting to governments the same way they reacted in the first wave. That there's a whole different tone of criticism, a whole different tone of judgment, and there's less blinded solidarity. People are looking back now at mistakes. So I think the politics of COVID, which so benefited incumbents for the last 6 months, is already starting to turn.
I agree. I feel it in Ontario, don't you, Jenny? I mean, I think you can feel that. I think it's driven. Maybe I'm just myopic because of my kids going to school, but I think it's driven by school boards and the pissing match. And for 6 weeks, we've had a steady diet of how's it going to work, and the premier and Lecce, the education minister, talking about unions and all this. And I just think it's starting to break the kind of, okay, we've got emergency rules all in this together, and more traditional boundaries and divisions are emerging.
Yeah, I somewhat agree with that. I think that David's right. I sense that there is a difference, but I also agree it's going to get worse. I think this is not going to get better in time. And I think I probably said this on the pod. If I didn't, I would have said it at the height of April to anyone that would have called me at the height of this happening, is governments needed to, and I was talking specifically about the Ontario government, they needed to break this into three different areas. If I'd been in the government, you would have had the immediate day-to-day. So you have a whole team of people that every day you're talking hospitalizations, ICUs, how many cases, literally the day-to-day stuff. You're on the phone with the federal government every day about what they're announcing. Then you've got the midterm stuff. So, okay, in March, April, are we going to actually close all the schools? Are we going to announce right now that parents, you guys, we're going to have to figure out something because you're not going to be back in June. If you remember, it was, Scott, you would know this better than David and I, every 2 weeks, it was like, well, it's just going to be another 2 weeks. It's going to be another 2 weeks. And then you would have had the people doing the long-term planning who you would have said, don't even fucking look at the daily numbers. You will figure out how we're going to get kids back to school safely in the next 6 months. And governments didn't do that. So people, I think, are extremely frustrated. And this kind of the hypocrisy or the rhetoric that governments got away with, to both of your points, isn't cutting it anymore. So we've got this, so-called second wave. There's only 251 cases now. Hospitalizations are low. Like Scott, you said, health officials are worried about hospitalizations. They're surmising that hospitalizations are going to go up, but there was only 7 people in the province on ventilators in ICU yesterday.
Well, but that's a more complicated issue. Ventilators aren't being used as frequently because people don't actually. But they came to the conclusion they weren't actually very helpful. In fact, might kill you.
But there were 30 some people in hospitals yesterday. So I listen, let me finish. So what I'm saying is, and then you have Doug go out and say, well, we're going to shut everything down again. Okay, well, how are people getting this? So right now it's looking like it's social gathering. So people that can't afford to go out and go to a restaurant or sit on a patio, and it's starting to get colder. So sitting outside is becoming less of an option. So why is the government even musing about shutting down businesses and restaurants when it seems that the problem is with social gatherings? And the problem is we are still having flights in daily from hotspots like Israel, that for a country of 9 million is last week was recording 3,000 to 4,000 new cases a day. But flights are coming in every day from Israel and from China and from Italy. And so I think that as people are less scared and getting more information, this is the problem they have with government. So it can't just be there like the standing up and saying, we're all in this together and we'll get through this and just trust us. People aren't willing to listen to that anymore. There's my rant.
I got a different take on it, I think. I mean, I agree with a lot of the a lot of what you say there, but I think I really sharply differ when it comes to what's the natural and logical response of government. I think it would be a foolish, potentially suicidal government that would go out now and say, I'm not going to start to muse about the possibility of having to do this, because the public, if these cases start to rise, and we can all pretend we're epidemiologists, but it appears as though it's when cases begin to rise, there is a lag factor, and that is as good an indication as any as to what's going to happen later. We talk about Israel. Well, what happened in Israel? They had a gigantic second wave. You started seeing cases rise first, then hospitalization and mortalities. Now they're exploding all over. They've had to roll back. So I think as a government, if you're to say, listen, now we won't, they may start to rise. Don't worry about that. It's not going to be that big a deal, and I'm not going to contemplate rolling back these other things. That I think people would go, come again? What are you all about there? And I'm not sure, by the way, that that's the right health response either. So I think governments must demonstrate over and over again that public health is their main priority. I think it's been proven so far that, as anxious as we all might be about economic futures, that people demand that their government put public health first in really graphic terms. And so I think it would be a really strange government decision to communicate that they weren't looking at rolling things back if cases continue to increase.
Where I would disagree on that is it's not the government's job to figure out exactly where the community spread is happening, because it doesn't seem like it's the person walking into the Foot Locker with a mask to buy a pair of running shoes, or sitting 6 feet away from the next table at your local restaurant or on a patio. If it's social gatherings, if it's people coming into the country and not quarantining, then why aren't governments working on solutions to fix that, as opposed to musing about shutting down the economy again? I think that's wholly irresponsible.
Well, I don't think those things are mutually exclusive.
Well, but there's no proof of that. Even politicians are musing that it's social gatherings. The problem is it's harder to stop those.
So speaking of wholly irresponsible, the speech from the throne. Who agrees with me that in the last week, after having done essentially no expectations management on this thing for a few weeks and letting expectations about what it was run pretty wild, feels to me like they've been reeling that thing back in hard in the last week in terms of what we should expect from it. I think that Jenny's suspicion that it was going to be pretty high level and not very granular is proving to be what the new line is. And any real transformational stuff, they appear now to be kicking to the economic statement or a budget whenever one of those things emerges later in the fall. Is that indicative of internal dispute about what should be in that speech from the throne and what that program is? Freeland is just getting into place in finance and maybe just starting to assert herself. But it appears a little less certain about how big, bold, and transformational this thing is going to be than it did 2 weeks ago.
Isn't this just another good example of how uncanny I am at predicting the future and being correct? In the sense that, didn't I say last week that we should all be careful that the big grand verbiage and rhetoric around it might be a bait and switch, and then it's more likely to get reeled in. And I've felt that. I think they were off tone in their immediate characterizations when they were like talking about legacy programs for the prime minister, talking about, oh, well, this is the perfect opportunity for us to transform and green our economy, and that's our priority. It sounded like they were signaling that their priority was them, the government, the things they could do, the things that would reflect well historically on Trudeau. And I think they quickly realized that's not what people are shopping for. So we better stop saying that and let's get more pragmatic. And I don't know that what they plan to do has actually changed dramatically, but the way that they made a judgment that they were going to go out and talk about it differently. And so now it's childcare, it's going to be those things that they can actually root in an economic thesis, it'll be public health management, impeachment. I think they've tried to tame it because they did a piss poor job initially of framing it. It was framed as, get a load of us, we're going to transform the country, and it's all going to be statues to Trudeau. And so I think this was almost inevitable that they were going to do this, because the initial framing of the thing was disastrously self-referential.
Well, and they could just be walking it back. They could just be walking it back because they realized that, to Scott's point, it's not something that's saleable to or saleable to the Canadian people as what they thought it would be. Or maybe we're just giving them too much credit and they've just changed their messaging. Like sometimes it's the easiest answer is the actual answer. And so I know the front page of the Post today talked about, it was a big picture of Freeland talking about wealth redistribution. And in the article, you had ministers like Wilkinson and McKenna, to your point, David, who are kind of walking back the expectations in terms of spending. The words were still there, green economy or what have you. So I remain to say it will be extremely high level and potentially just a lot more details in whatever economic statement Freeland does.
Well, that's always going to be the case. There's never been a good speech from the throne. There's never been a deadly specific speech from the throne, short, precise. There never has been, never will be.
No, but if the speech from the throne had committed to a basic income, that would be news.
Right. I don't think we're going to see that. I never really thought we were going to see that.
Right.
I never did. The other thing, sorry, can I have one more thing, is that we sometimes overestimate the media framing and how deliberate everything is. I think we all know this, right? But I know it in particular as a communications director, because I, as supposedly the guy that was trying to shape the government's message, would wake up often and read the newspaper and think, where the fuck did that come from? And so, I think that you've had the National Post run a few front page stories that say, with like God only knows who their source is, like, Joe Blow at the corner bar. And next thing you know, it's like, it's going to be a carbon tax of $1 squillion, and they're going to transform the economy, and they're coming for you, and they're going to take away your pension and all this shit. And I think they felt like they got to get back into it.
Go back to the Prime Minister's own rhetoric. It was pretty dramatic about what they were going to do.
Mm-hmm. Right? I don't dispute that. I'm just saying that sometimes also, like, they're tacking back into the wind, because the thing was, the Prime Minister uses that rhetoric. Then the National Post goes on a campaign because it wants to characterize this as all wild-eyed social engineering. It gets over the top. And then they've got to intervene more strenuously and say, let's be more disciplined, for Pete's sake.
Well, this is a very centralized Prime Minister's office. Like when they were leaking stories about we're having cabinet meetings and we're actually talking to caucus to get direction from the speech from the throne. They said it as in it was like this. Holy crap, no other government has ever done that where
I do love that about this government, eh? They do that a lot, right? Wow, we found something new. We're talking to our MPs.
We're talking to our MPs. And which is something that would I'm assuming it definitely happened for us. I assumed it happened it happened for you guys, but this is going to be very centrally driven, even if that's what the rhetoric is going to be. And Trudeau is, if anything, he has become, as the days go on and the years go on, he is purely political. He did an announcement with Doug in Northern Ontario on Friday, where he talked a lot about green energy and the green economy, standing outside of a gold mine, and the backdrop was a backhoe. Like it is this guy can get away with he's talking about.
When wasn't he purely political? I mean, he's a politician, for Pete's sake. Like, what is that? They're all purely political. If you're not, you're Kevin Vickers.
Yeah, but it's not like it's not like there's even pretending anymore.
I think that I'm sure Dan Arnold's polling is telling them that people are still super focused on COVID. Yeah. And that if the government was seen to be abandoning the fight against COVID to embark on some grand projects, that people would rebel against that. That people still want government's job one focus to be managing the COVID crisis.
I bet if there's one big change that's happened in the last month in terms of the way they're thinking about the speech from the throne, literally, like, what will it say? I bet it's that point. I bet it's the addition of a first chapter, which probably didn't necessarily exist before, which is finishing the fight on COVID. and that they've come to the conclusion that anything they say must begin with that chapter. That to skip past that chapter and say, this crisis has given us an opportunity to transform Canada. We're now going to have 6 provinces. It's going to blow your mind, people. That will not work, right? People are like, no, focus on the fight in front of me. Okay, so I agree with you there. I think they've really... I see leaks about the structure of the speech from the throne. Those are the kinds I'm inclined to believe come from a place of knowledge, because no one else cares and no one else knows. Yep. And the fact they're saying that means that they know they have to start with the bread and butter.
But to David's point on the guaranteed income, that can easily be tied into a COVID response in terms of the economy.
Don't you think? And I'll get above my head policy-wise very quickly. I think where you will see alterations to EI, and there will be, I don't think we'll see universal basic income, but I think we'll see, they'll say one of the things that this crisis has revealed is that our EI structures are inadequate. We've had to implement and improvise structures to take care of them. The CERB isn't a permanent solution. So here's some things we're going to put in place as an alternative going forward structurally. And they'll be able to draw on the basic income language without committing to a basic income policy. That's what I think will end up happening somewhere in that zone.
Interesting. That will be a tougher sell politically. Hey, let's talk about Alberta for a couple of minutes, because I think I've just been, maybe just me, but I think it's interesting that Alberta is now definitively, it seems to me, a 2-party province as opposed to a 1-party province. They had for decades and decades really no question as to who was going to form the government. No competitive elections. And the NDP appear to be hanging around as a legitimate force. And there's a poll out in the last couple of days that says the 2 parties are tied at around 38% of the vote. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that poll is that they show that the Premier Kenney's support is down, but it actually hasn't gone to the NDP. They're still getting roughly the same number of votes they got in the last election. His vote, and this surprised me so much because on my Twitter feed, all I see is anger about the service cuts that Kenney's been implementing in Alberta. Education cuts, health cuts, that agenda. My Twitter feed is full of anger about that, but his vote is splintering to the right, not to the left. So the votes that he's lost have gone to places like the Western Independence Party, for example. So you now have a split vote on the right and almost a collapsed vote on the left with no real force there. But in any event, Alberta appears to have become a competitive political jurisdiction, and that's a huge change in our time.
No, it's definitely different from what it was 20 years ago when it was just successive Tory governments. I think there's a few things with the poll. I think Jason is just over a year into his mandate, so he's only about 15 or 16 months into his mandate, and he's had to deal with some tough challenges even before COVID in terms of the collapse of oil prices and pipeline politics and what have you. I think that if you look at the numbers, the seat count is still on Jason's side. Alberta's becoming like everywhere else. There is an urban-rural divide. Edmonton and Calgary versus essentially the rest of the province. I think that if you look at the Angus Reid poll, it didn't include the Alberta Liberal Party, who were inconsequential during the last election, the same as what the other Wild Rose parties were. But in certain ridings in Calgary, they were getting upwards of 6 to 7% of the vote. So it was kind of weird they weren't included in that vote. And I assume are being absorbed, especially in Calgary, by the NDP is benefiting from that in polls like this. If you remember, I think by the end it was Ipsos, David, your buddy. Daryl Bricker, who up until think the last week of the poll were predicting. Pardon?
He's your buddy?
Well, every time he comes up, David likes to tell stories about him, so I assumed a buddy. So
I'm just being a bit of a dink. That's all.
I know. And so, but he had the NDP winning, doing significantly better in Calgary. So I think there's a lot of factors there, but I think that ultimately Jason has had challenges in terms of the economy at a much different level than what the other provinces have had to deal with on top of COVID.
And that's why you think he hasn't gotten the same COVID bounce everybody else got, because the economy's worse?
I think, well, they went into COVID with the economy being worse in terms of the oil sands.
I agree with all that. I think there's a couple other factors. One, it used to be the way to beat the Indian, as you say, the province has changed demographically. It has become less politically monolithic than it used to be. But I think one of the reasons for that is, for the longest time, the way that you would try to compete to beat the Alberta PCs was to be the Alberta PCs. I mean, that's what Lawrence Decore tried to do in the 1990s.
Outright them.
Yeah, and I think that really, you got the end of the dynasty stuff and all that. But I think what the NDP showed in the last election, and then even when they governed, was that you could try to compete with them by not being them, and by offering a crisp alternative and a stark choice. And so I think we're likely to see that two-party state exist. I also think, I agree with Jenni, tougher times for him. There were structural problems, obviously, with their economy going into all of this. I always thought that he was going to have a rougher ride than people thought. But I also think he just might not be Ralph Klein, right? Like, he's not, I mean, he's obviously not Ralph Klein. He's not a populist politician in that sense. But he may not just be the greatest politician in the goddamn world. And, people said, like, now that Kenney's here, it's going to restore, Pax Conservatera, and he's going to be, it's great. I just don't, like, I've known Jason a long time, and I quite like him as an individual. But he might not make it out of this. You know what I mean?
I don't think there's evidence of that. They're so early in their mandate. I think he has had to make some tough decisions. I think he has a very good dynamic in terms of working with the federal government when there are initiatives. He's spoken very publicly, complimentary of Chrystia Freeland, and has said so, has spoken about her privately as well as holding the Liberals' feet to account. I think I was in the Premier's office here in Ontario when Rachel Notley was Premier, and it was leading into the big fight in December of the Council of Federations in December of 2018 on pipelines, and she had done a huge lead up of communications in leading into this meeting. She showed up late. She did a scrum walking in. And when she sat down at the table, she basically just sat and stared at him and spoke to him. And it wasn't that she decided she was going to be the Ralph Klein. I'm going to fight with you outside, but I'm going to be charming inside and try to get something for Alberta. She was essentially said nothing in the meeting. So I think that Jason, for the actual interest of Alberta, has shown more leadership in the last 15 months that he's been Premier than what she did for the 4 years previous to that.
Okay. My point is this.
Speaking
I
of,
think he may not win the next election, and I'm just putting that on the board there. David can collect the vig, but I'm making an early prediction.
And I disagree with you.
That's great. So we'll make a little wager on that.
Well, when you talk about standing up for Alberta and speaking your mind, I'll be interested to hear what Jason Kenney has to say about Energy East, because Aaron O'Toole went into Quebec and met with Francois Legault and came out, and if Justin Trudeau had said at any point during the Energy East issue what Aaron O'Toole said yesterday, Jason Kenney and Alberta Conservatives, Albertans, period, would have freaked. Aaron O'Toole basically sat down with Legault, came out and said, yeah, you know what? Energy East is a non-starter. There's no pipelines going through Quebec.
Yeah.
No.
And well, he had to walk back. He had to walk back initial comments on that, and also Bill 21 as well, to say, well, these are the positions of the federal government or the provincial government, and ergo that's their decision. It's not what I think. I hope it's early days. I think Aaron has had a very good month, close to a month as leader. I think that, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. I think that it was rough ground in talking originally about the CERB on his interview with Mercedes Stevenson on Global. I'm assuming that clip could come back to haunt him if there is an election campaign this fall. So I think that it just shows he will have to be very careful in terms of he's learning what politicians in Canada on all sides of the party, on all parties, have realized about how politics are so different depending on the region that you're in, and Quebec and Alberta, for the most part, could not be more diametrical opposites.
Tough to manage. Tough to manage. Peter MacKay owes $1 million.
You got to go like this.
Yeah. $1 million. He will never pay that back.
No. I can't see how we can, not with the fundraising rules. As we talked about, I think it's only been recently that candidates like Hetty Fry have been able to pay off ones from like the 2007, 2008 leadership races. And that's 12 years ago. Those debts we're talking $150,000 to $200,000. So I'm not sure how this could be.
People don't give money to pay off debt. It's the least motivating request for money you can possibly give. So you're talking about friends and family or people that donate to pay down debt.
I will personally pay off Kevin O'Leary's campaign debt if he promises to go away and never speak in public again. So that's it.
Really?
No.
Really?
No, I was...
Thought maybe you'd ask something a little bit more difficult, like take some accountability for the boat accident.
No kidding. She had a drink after. David, read the newspaper, read the statements of claim and defense. She had a drink after the accident. Her nerves were so rattled. Yeah. Fuck. Yeah.
I was never an O'Leary fan. I disliked him from the moment he announced he was going to be in the race.
He wore capri pants. He was photographed as a candidate in an airport going to Florida wearing capri pants. Game, set, match. Okay.
I was on that flight.
Goodbye.
So I just got to take a break and tell you that my brother-in-law, Stephen, asked me to eat this chocolate.
Awesome.
Asked me to eat this chocolate on the air. And so I'm going to do that. But I think it was in his pocket for quite a while, so I don't know how this is going to go.
I'm not familiar with that brand of chocolate. What is that?
Stephen has a lot of candies. The ones he gives out tend not to be brand name.
He keeps
the brand name for himself.
I don't eat white label chocolate.
I think they have Rice Krispies in them.
Yeah, it's a Hershey, so that's encouraging. Yeah, they do have a little Rice Krispie in there. That's not bad. Thanks, Stephen.
I don't like that. Do you guys like chocolate with orange in it?
No.
I hate that more than anything I think in the world. Like, I think I hate that like more than Nazis even. Like, I hate it.
Chocolate and mint don't deserve to go together either.
Agreed. 100%. I see people ordering that in like an ice cream parlor, and I think they should be
How do you feel about salt?
Oh, I love salt.
On chocolate?
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's okay. I'm not a chocolate eater. I prefer chips.
I see. I'm a chocolate guy, but nobody loves the salt. Anyway, I want to end on this note with us. We've been talking about these elections that people, there's a conservative leadership race that happened. There's the New Brunswick election. There's going to be other elections. They're all being held virtually. There's no tours. There's no media bus. There's no advance.
Oh, I would have given my eye teeth to run a campaign with none of those three things.
I know. They're the most difficult things. But they're also, like when we were younger and actually doing those jobs, not overseeing the people that do those
Yesterday, jobs. When I was
those are great experiences. Like you have killer experiences on the road during campaigns. The people you meet and the things you go through. I remember I joined the Liberal Party in Saskatchewan in 1979. So the quick history is, in 1971, the Liberal Party is the government of Saskatchewan, has $1 million in the bank, and owns its own building. And by 1978, they have no members in the legislature, and they are $650,000 in debt. So that's a 7-year stretch that was chronicled in a book by a guy named Barry Wilson called The Politics of Defeat. So I joined after that, and it was tough slogging. Like it was, and I was working with Ralph provincially, and it was extremely discouraging. And then Ralph convinced Iona Campagnola, who was the president of the Federal Liberal Party, to come out and spend
majestic, wonderful person.
Spend a week in Saskatchewan barnstorming the province. Iona, people may not remember, but Iona Campagnola was a huge celebrity in Canada in the 70s and 80s. Brilliant woman, gorgeous woman, striking person. And she came out, and I was in charge of Advance. And at a time when I might have considered drifting away because the prospects were so futile, Iona actually gave me a new lease on life because she was so popular. We had a breakfast event in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, with 500 people come out to see Iona Campagnolo at a time when people would have only come to see the Prime Minister to throw things at him, and people wouldn't have come to see the provincial Liberal leader under any circumstance. And so I got to spend a week traveling around Saskatchewan with Iona and watching these magical events happen. And it really, I mean, I'll remember that week forever, especially those 500 people at 7:30 in the morning in Prince Albert. Jenny, got a campaign story? Got a road story?
Well, I guess one's similar. When I first got involved, I was a reformer in Ontario, so I feel your pain. And during the 97 election, I might have already told this, but during the 97 election, we had the youth bus, and I met a lot of friends to this day. Ray Novak, Corey Tonight, we all met on this bus in 97 and drove around Ontario, and mostly drove around the GTA. And it was pretty slim pickings for the Reform Party in the GTA in 1997. But I had no idea because I had nothing to base it on. And so I actually kept this journal. It was called like the bus log. And we had a giant picture of Chrétien at the back of the Greyhound bus. And we'd get liberal literature from every riding we would go in. And we called it the hit list, like a big sign. But if you go back and read this journal, like we'd be in Etobicoke North door knocking, and I'm like, had a great day in Etobicoke North today.
Everybody was so nice.
I think we've really got a chance at picking this one up. And we didn't even get our deposit back. And that's when I think you only had to get like 10% of the 10% to like get your deposit back. And so that entire campaign, we knocked on doors every single day, and we did not win one riding that I knocked on. But it changed the trajectory of my life for difference.
Yeah, so, sounds like you made lifelong friends during that.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine a campaign where you wouldn't get to go and have that experience. And I've done campaigns in headquarters, and I've done campaigns on the road, and when I've been on the plane, and I just love the plane so much more. I love the plane. And in 2004, I'm on the plane, and it's me and Scott Feschuk, and we're seated on the plane. Paul, Prime Minister, and his wife are directly in front of us. Scott and I sit directly behind him with big books, writing all the time, him complaining about changing his notes, us saying, you don't want to change your notes, you need to have a consistent message. We'll make little alterations. Anyways, by about the second week of the campaign, the second we would get on air, the stewardesses would have this dedicated crew that was with us. They would have cold cans of beer waiting in our spot the second week on it. Didn't matter what time of day it was, right? We would just sit and drink beer and write and get yelled at, and scraps of paper would come flying over the seat behind us, right? And you'd hear, fuck no good, right? And then on and on we go. But my favorite. And Scott had the thing called the BlackBerry blog that he just started writing on his own as a chronicle of the Liberal campaign.
Well, I thought that was 2006. That kept us all sane through the defeat.
I thought it was 2004, and he would write like, Scott Reid is touching my leg. I want it to stop. That would be like his entry for like 2 hours, right? But at 2004, intense campaign for us because, we start out in the lead, we lose the lead, looks like it's our Waterloo, then we come back. And on the very last couple of days of the campaign, we do this cross-country thing. So we stay up for over 24 hours. We start at the Atlantic coast. Paul dips his leg in the Atlantic coast, dips his foot in the Atlantic coast, and then we go events, barnstorm across the country, trying to demonstrate to people, we want it this bad. We'll do anything. We'll come to your house. Just Christ almighty, vote for us, right? And so we're working away, and we're doing event after event. We've had no sleep.
Kind of looked that way a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. But the tradition is on the flight back, you always have this speech to the media that the Prime Minister does, and it's an off-the-record thing. And so we crisscross the country, not sleeping. We're writing this thing. All that Paul is obsessed about the entire time is where is the speech for the media, right? It's got to be funny. It's got to be funny. And so we ring him. And then, we get there and we give him the speech, and he won't use swear words in it. So he's like scripting. I can't use that word. I don't even know that word. I don't even know what that word is these guys have written for me. Anyway, so we spend the whole time. We make that 24-hour journey, and I think it made a difference. I think the fun and energy that we felt on the campaign plane, making that journey, doing those stops, being in a plane hangar at 2:30 in the morning on the prairies and having, 1,000 people come out and cheer for you, it felt like we had momentum, and it felt like it was making a difference. And that's something you'll never get from a virtual campaign.
Well, in 2004, we were trying to show momentum and that we were going to pick up seats in Ontario by doing basically a cavalry from Edmonton down through Red Deer and Canmore and Drumheller, and then ending at Calgary. So as the Ontario desk, that campaign, that was a lot of fun. We were really showing that we were.
That remains the most perplexing last week move I've ever seen by a campaign, and I ran a campaign where the leader quit in the last week. So.
To this day, no one can give fully a straight answer, but it was extremely weird and perplexing.
It was like the movie Convoy with Chris Christopherson. You guys were just like on the highway, Big Ben this year's a rubber duck. I'm about to put the hammer down.
Oh, well, it was so great to talk with you guys today. Thank you for being thanks for coming out again today. And thank you everybody for listening to the show. If you like it, give us a shout out on social media or go to the iTunes website and give us a review and a rating. I want to thank Metal Donkersgood, the engineer of this program, and Jill Engelman, the producer of this program. They put in a lot of work. And of course, thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Scott. And we'll see you next week.
Ciao.
Ciao.